Dorothy Wolf here, and we're going to interview Dorothy and find out, what her life is all about. Hi, Dorothy.
Hi.
Would you just start out by telling us your name and your parents' name, and what's your maiden name?
My name is Dorothy Jean Peterson, and my mother's name is Florence Lorraine Peterson, and my father's name is Bennett Theodore Peterson. And I was born December 30th, 1931 in Bountiful, Utah, really in Valverde, which is where we lived, and it's right close to Bountiful. And I was born at home. All of my brothers and sisters were born at home, none of us in the hospital. And I imagine it was pretty snowy at that time.
So what number are you in the lineup of your siblings?
My father had 5 children with Addie Mae Wood, his first wife, which they were married when Dad was 29, and then she died when my sister Ruth was just a baby. And then he married my mother, Florence Lorraine Pulley, and she was 19 years old and the oldest in her family. And so she helped Dad raise those 4 children and had 11 of her own. And I am Mother's Mother and Dad's 9th child. But we were all like one family because they were all young when their mother died, and so we were like one family. And my mother was quite a remarkable woman to have been able to take on that responsibility at 19 years of age. And grandfather was not very happy in fact, he said, no, that wouldn't be a good idea if they got married. And finally, in a little while, because Mother was so persuasive and loved him so much, my grandfather decided that would be all right. And so anyway, they lived in Bountiful. Her folks lived in American Fork, Utah. And so she moved to Bountiful with Dad to Valverde, and they had a farm, a big fruit farm, and they cleared the land and planted all of the fruit trees and the grapes and everything from scratch. And so they were hard workers and had that was the main part of life, was work. In those days. When I came along, I was toward the end of the family, and so we had it quite a bit easier than our older brothers and sisters did. And when I was in 4th grade, we moved from the farm and moved into a house, a smaller house, and that's where I really grew up most of my growing up years. I remember my childhood was a lot of fun. My dad was he was a fun man. They worked hard and there was a lot of work, but he was fun, and we had a lot of music in our home, lots of music. And everyone played instruments, and my brother Charles had a band, and they called themselves the Rocky Mountain Wranglers, and they played on the radio stations, and that was fun to hear them practice. And I started taking piano lessons when I was, I think I must have been 5th grade, that I started taking piano lessons. And I rode into Salt Lake by myself on the streetcar and got off at the station and walked up the hill in Salt Lake up to the McCune School of Music and Art. And I took piano from Mrs. Thurman, my first years of piano. And then later I studied with Grace Lundberg, who was our neighbor. She lived not very far from us. And she was a marvelous pianist, and went to Juilliard when I was 15 years old. She left, and I won 2 piano scholarships and was able to take lessons with 2 different, one at the Mozart School of Music, and then one with Melvin Dunn, who was he was the man who took care of the Tabernacle Choir, and he was a graduate of the Royal Academy of Music in London. And so I took from him. And then, as far as my music was concerned, after I was married, I, of course, had children and wasn't able to study much, but I still played, and we got a piano when, I don't know, I think I was pregnant with Joe. Might have been Jeff. And so then I had a piano to practice on all the time, and that was really neat. Music's been very important in my life.
Yeah.
And
So you lived and grew up in Bountiful this whole time?
yes.
And your children were born in
My
Salt Lake
children
area?
were all born in Salt Lake at different hospitals. Jim and Jerry were born at St. Mark's Hospital, and then John was born at the Elias Hospital, and then Jeff and Joe were born at the hospital on 21st. It was the county hospital, but that's where my doctor was, and so that's where I went to have them. And he was on the staff there, and so I went there to have my 2 last children. I had Jim when I was 17, and by the time I was 25, before I turned 25, Joe was born in August, and I turned 25 in December. So by the time I was 25, I had 5 little boys. And they were a handful.
Yeah.
But a lot of fun. And I had quite a few problems with my health, and had from a young woman, and so it made that part of my life even more difficult, because when they're little it takes a lot of physical work. They weren't nearly as difficult as teenagers, because they could take care of their physical things, and also helped me out a lot. And so that was but they were a joy. We had a swimming pool when they were small, and they all learned how to swim, which is the reason they all love water, I guess, to this day. And they really enjoyed that. They were a lot of fun.
Good. Tell me a little bit about ancestors.
Okay, my grandfather on my dad's side was a Baptist minister in Mississippi, and the missionaries converted him. My grandmother, Easterling, had died, and Dad had 6 boys, or Grandpa had 6 boys, and my dad was the oldest. Bennett was the oldest, and Uncle Henry was the next oldest. Daddy was 16, and so he and Uncle Henry were baptized. And there is an account of Dad's, of their conversion, of Grandfather's conversion. And later on, they came to Utah. And Grandfather had remarried then. He married Missouri Clay. He was married to Anna Caroline Easterling first, and then after she died, he married Missouri Clay. And they left there and came to Utah, to the Bountiful area first, with all of the children. And my grandmother's family, the Easterlings, were very upset about them joining the church, and also about them leaving there. And we had no contact with my grandmother's family for many, many years, until at 63 my father went back there on a mission and reestablished the relationship with our Easterling relatives, and they were all Baptists. But it's a very interesting article, the diaries of the missionaries that converted. It was Elder Moss and Elder Gardner that converted my grandfather, and they called him a hard-shell Baptist minister. And he was, but they stayed at his house, and quite often, and it took almost a year before he joined the church, but he read everything, and was truly converted when he, and it was very hard for him to leave. He came from Denmark, my grandfather, when he was a young man, probably about 17. We don't know where the ship landed that he came on, but he did end up as a young man in Mississippi, and he was a very good carpenter. He had learned that trade as he was growing up, and so he built their first house. And my brother Ben and Ted, brothers, saw the house, and since they've been back and they've kept touch and been to some of the Easterling family reunions, so that was really a wonderful thing for us to have our families to know again of our heritage, and to be able to keep in touch with them. And one of my aunts, Emma Easterling, who my sister is named for, my sister Emma, she came. She was a anesthesiologist, one of the first in the country. She was trained, and my grandfather was evidently the doctor in that area that they had, and it tells in his history that he had a kit with the medical things that he did for people to help them, and anyway, that's kind of interesting, being as I have two sons that were interested enough in medicine to go into that field. And evidently grandfather was very interested. I never knew my grandfather. He had died before I was born. And also my grandmother. And I do remember Missouri Clay just as a small child, like 3 and 4, because she died right around that time. And so I didn't ever have any grandparents. And except my grandfather pulling my mother's father, and he lived to be 90-something, 93 or something like that. And I remember him in my early childhood, and then in my, I think he died when I was 13. And so, and my grandmother had already died before I was born. So I didn't have but very little grandparenting in my life. And I think that's one of the reasons my grandchildren are so important to me, is because I felt I really missed having a grandmother. And so I care deeply for my grandchildren, and I feel very privileged that I've been able to see most of them grow up and know them each well and love them dearly. And I'm so grateful for them, each one of them. and for their love for the gospel and their love for the Savior and their desire to be obedient and do the things that Heavenly Father wants them to do. And I think that is one of the reasons their lives are so successful. And we all have difficulties, but generally we're very happy, and it's a very joyous life, even when difficulties come, because we really understand. And I'm so grateful to my grandfather that he joined the church, that he knew it was true, and that those missionaries stayed. They kept going back and talking with him and leaving him things to read and study. He was very, very studious man, and so was my father. My father was very dedicated to the gospel and very studious. And he knew President McKay was a good friend of his. And he went back to Adirondack when they secured that property for the church with his brother-in-law, Wilford Wood, and President McKay. He wasn't president of the church then, President McKay wasn't. He was an apostle. And I remember him very well as a little girl. And when I was pregnant with Jim, I was working at Miller Floral, and he came from Huntsville. He went up there. That's where he grew up, and so he'd go up and he had horses up there and things. And on his way back, he would always stop at the floral company to get some roses for Emma Ray, his wife. And I was down disbudding carnations, and I was getting pretty pregnant. And he sent someone down to get me, and so I came up and I had really long hair, and I'm sure I was kind of sweaty from being in the greenhouses, because they're kind of humid. And I came up and President McKay was quite a tall man, and had beautiful, beautiful white hair, and he just brushed my hair and put his arms around me and asked me how I was feeling, and he's really a dear man. And before Jim was born, President Benson, who was an apostle, then gave me a blessing, and before Jerry was born and before John was born. Fun about the farm, not only was it hard work, but there was a lot of land and a lot of space, and we had a big ball diamond, and my sisters and brothers and their families would come home often, like on Saturdays, and Mother'd fix food, and they'd play baseball and everything, and then we'd sing, and it was a great family time, because we were the youngest, and so our nieces and nephews were as old and older than we were, and so we really looked forward, being the last three, to them coming home and enjoying their friendship. And because they lived close until World War II, a lot of them were close, and so they would come often. And my brothers had to help with all the farming. My brothers didn't get to play ball and things like that in school because they had to work. And they didn't seem to resent it at all. And my sisters too. Now they were very active in school things, and Jeanette was real musical. Well, all of them were, and so they were in the plays and everything like that. And but our entertainment a lot was our family and the church. And we did in the church in those days too. They did wonderful things. They put on big productions and things like that, so it gave us all a chance for our talents to grow. And it was. I remember my childhood being very happy. I enjoyed my childhood, and we had hard times. But in fact, when the war started, because my brothers, everybody was gone to war, and so Dad had to hire someone to help with the farm, and he just couldn't, it just didn't work out, and we really lost the farm for $3,500. That's not very much money nowadays, but in those days it was a lot of money, and Dad just was getting old, and he couldn't keep it up, and he could have probably raised the money. He was offered it in a couple, but he couldn't keep it up, so he let it go, and we moved to a smaller house not very far away, about a block and a half away. So we still were close to where we grew up, and to that point, but I was young. I was probably 4th grade, I think. So I remember more of the little house, and I remember a lot about the farm, because those were really happy days. And after the war, everybody was gone. Everybody was gone. My brothers-in-law were in the service. My brothers were in the war. And so it wasn't, no one came home then. No one, it was hard times. And Daddy worked at the Remington Arms plant, and Mother worked at where they made uniforms for Pike's, I think it was Pike's Manufacturing, where they made uniforms for the boys, and they, so that was kind of my teenage year. I was 9 when the war started, and so that was kind of, but what was my happy part was taking piano. That was a real happy time. And my brother Ted, and my sister Jeanette, and my brother Charles sent money home for me to take piano lessons. And that meant a lot to me. And anyway, the farm life, we had grapes, we had peaches, pears, apricots, apples. We had a lot of almond nut trees. And then we had lots of grapes, lots and lots of grapes. And the Greeks and Italians would come out and buy tons of grapes from Dad. And some of them we picked, and some of them they would come and pick. And I went to market with my dad quite a lot, and I would have been pretty small, because we left there when I was 5th grade, 4th or 5th grade, and so I would go to market with Dad, and I remember we had a big garage, and they had benches, and we'd put the fruit in all these boxes, and it was shipped all over, and it was beautiful. They had, it was all laid, just sewn boxes, and Dad won a lot of prizes at the fair for his fruit and his grapes and things. And we had a hammock up in the trees. I remember we used to play, and the younger ones of us did a lot of playing, and the older ones did a lot of the work, because we weren't very old. Mm-hmm. And I remember one time my sister and I were supposed to be up picking up apples off the ground for the pigs, and we each had a bucket, and we were playing on the trees. We were hanging from our knees and just playing and having a great time. And I guess the hours passed, and we didn't come back, and so Dad came to get us. And the only time I ever remember my dad spanking me ever was as when he got up there and saw we were just playing, and we had to pick up those buckets full of apples quick, and then all the way down, and he just picked up a little grape switch that had been trimmed off, and I remember getting a couple of those. And I was brokenhearted, because he didn't do that much. That's the only time I ever remember.